Hey everybody, welcome back to Rewild, where we talk about environment, psychology, and other interesting things. For today's topic, I thought we would talk a little bit about the New York floods that happened this weekend. A lot of places along the East Coast are flooding this past week, and I've seen a lot of really scary footage. And personally, I have to be really careful what I watch when it comes to big weather disasters because I can kind of get to doom scrolling. So we did that a little bit today, and I thought that I would talk about it. I learned a couple things about New York City I didn't know that are pretty interesting, and I wanted to bring up a couple ideas around the psychology of what it looks like living through a climate collapse, as well as some thoughts on city design, city planning, and what the future might look like for a more sustainable world. So the first thing that I've been thinking about a lot with respect to what's going on in New York is New Yorkers, you guys are so intense and resilient. Every time I see something going on in New York, it's just astonishing to me, like the level of confidence and just I've been to New York City twice, and the cliche is that New Yorkers have seen it all, and you guys are unfazed. And I know it's probably really scary for some people, and I found myself worrying a lot for homeless and other vulnerable populations. The animals at the zoo, if you are from New York and you know updates about how the animals are doing, and or if you are also part of other nonprofits that work with vulnerable groups, I'm kind of curious because I know for such a large urban area, it's probably pretty likely that you folks have pretty solid plans set in place, I would imagine, for such a populated area. I'm pretty fascinated by that, and I'm fascinated by the engineering that it takes, especially as somebody who mostly lives in rural places. It just takes so much knowledge and skills to create infrastructure like that in the first place. And it's pretty interesting to see people just going about their lives, even though it's hard, it's crazy. So if you are out there, if you are struggling, drop any nonprofits that folks can donate to in the comments. Let us know how you're doing. My heart really goes out to anybody that's really been impacted so far. Everything I've seen is kind of like joke posts about people just sort of having a good time or just feeling like this is pretty almost amusing. Dogs and kids are laughing and playing in the rain, but I know for some people it's probably a lot more serious. And in the future, it's probably going to get more serious. So I wanted to talk a little bit about climate change, as well as something that, could be a New Yorker thing, but I think it's also a humanity thing, where I feel like a lot of us have just gotten used to extreme weather patterns. And it's almost like we're more used to that and we're resolved towards that more than having the capacity to think about how we build a better world that doesn't have issues like this, right? So that's a little bit more of an abstract kind of eco-psychology perspective, but I do find myself wondering when I see the grit and the tenacity of New York folks and other people in natural disasters who are really brave and resilient. Are we getting used to this stuff more than we should? And what I mean by that is there seems to almost be like a nihilism to it, or just like the grit and the resilience. But one thing I learned about resilience from somebody who was actually kind of toxic is that sometimes having a lot of it is a way to avoid taking care of yourself, right? And this is not anything on people in this area in particular. I think this applies to every one of us. But when you are forced to be resilient over and over again, when you've learned to be resilient, and then things just keep coming, they keep getting worse and worse, what do we as citizens, as the public, do to create a world where people don't have to be resilient anymore? I hope that makes sense for people. The person who once told me they admired my resilience ended up being very, very hard on me. And so taking a psychological kind of like toxic, in psychology we call it cluster B, like narcissist, like lens to the idea that resilience is this great thing. I think sometimes in our culture, in our society, we really venerate people being resilient because it allows us to not help them as quickly as they deserve. It allows us to sort of like shelve urgency and really not fight for the better world, the better society that we all deserve. Some interesting things I learned about New York today that I didn't know before. And again, I'm fascinated by like just the ingenuity of everything, the history, the old subway caverns that, people go urban exploring in, just the stuff like that, Prohibition era New York. I learned that the subways, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the subways were designed to flood so they don't collapse, which is kind of similar to skyscrapers in San Francisco having a little bit of sway to them during earthquakes to prevent them from collapsing. So I think that's kind of interesting. I think there's a Chinese proverb about that, about bamboo being able to bend so it doesn't break. So that was an interesting thing I learned. Another interesting thing I learned is that New York City is sinking under the weight of like 1.6 trillion tons of skyscraper, and that it was built on like marshlands, and that the indigenous people of New York actually had built their cities kind of like along these rivers, and supposedly there's even like an underground river in New York that was sort of like built to run off all of that water. So between that and climate change and climate collapse and the weight of all these skyscrapers and New York City continuing to build mega skyscrapers, I think we're seeing an increase of these types of events that are pretty scary, especially when you think about like the pollution of the water. And personally, again, I go back to wondering like, how is the homeless population doing? How are like the animals, how are those who don't get counted by census doing, undocumented folks? So far, I couldn't find any casualties from this particular event, but I know that a couple years ago there were, and we've also had a lot of storms in recent years in other areas that did have casualties. So I've just been thinking about that a little bit. I don't know if I want the station to be a place where I just pop on to talk about like climate disaster events around the world, because there really is a new one every week. But one thing that today really got me thinking about is how resilience is impressive. It's good like for the individual people who are resilient and strong and like unafraid. I'm really glad for you. I'm glad for us. I think I'm one of those people too. But I want to also remind folks in our climate community that I think to some extent resilience isn't fair. It's kind of ableist. It's kind of harsh. I think that we should value things like government responsibility and like things like collective agency and collective activism as much or more than individual resilience, because it prevents us from having a cop-out and it gives us a long-term solution that isn't just allowing some of us to be part of an attrition rate, those who can't afford to survive natural disasters, those who can't afford to leave, and those who are not resilient, who maybe can't handle trauma like that. So that's about all I had to say today. I just wanted to keep this short and sweet. I want to send like love and blessings to anybody in New York or any other place that whenever you're watching this, if you are in the middle of one of these disasters, I hope you're safe. I hope you and your family are okay, and that we all get the support and the help that we need from our societies and help each other out as citizens to make sure that people are safe. And also people can handle the aftermath of, sometimes being homeless or losing everything you own, working with FEMA for years, trying to get things going again. A natural disaster hits and it can be traumatizing in the moment, but there's also years of recovery for a lot of people, especially now when things are financially hard. That recovery process extends out, and I would like to see, especially in America, especially in countries that are not doing more with respect to transitioning to clean energy, we need that, and we also need more support from resilience systems. I want to say FEMA, but I know that they get kind of a bad rap, but either more funding and or more oversight and more personnel to make sure that community need, that social need is filled. We talk a lot about job creation, I think, when we think about climate collapse and green economies. And I think about that a lot when it comes to emergency services and recovery as well. So I hope to see that in our future. And if you're out there and you're experiencing this, I wish you a lot of peace and love and safety for you and yours. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Bye.